Hi, welcome. Enjoy the content, subscribe, and turn on notifications.
It was supposed to be a regular weekend, the kind couples and friends organized to break away from routine once in a while. Jonathan and Melissa had been married for 8 years, and this sort of invitation was almost a tradition between them: shared friends, casual conversation, wine on the porch, laughter that lasted late into the night. But this time, something felt different. Jonathan noticed it as soon as they passed through the gate of the countryside house. Melissa was quieter than usual, avoided physical contact, and kept checking her phone constantly. When Jonathan tried to make conversation during the drive, she responded with short sentences and turned her eyes back to the screen. When it was time to greet the other guests, she did just enough. She smiled, hugged, talked, but without the sparkle in her eyes she usually had at these events. Jonathan thought maybe it was just exhaustion. Melissa had a heavy schedule lately with the cosmetics company she ran, splitting her time between investor meetings and trips to industry events. It made sense that she'd be worn out. But everything really changed when Brent arrived. He was one of the guests nobody knew well, an acquaintance of a friend, added to the guest list last minute. As soon as he walked in, Melissa tensed up. Jonathan noticed. She automatically fixed her hair, adjusted her posture, and took a deep breath before walking over to him. The handshake lasted longer than normal. Her smile seemed forced. Brent looked unusually comfortable for someone who had just met everyone. Throughout the day, Jonathan started noticing patterns. Melissa always found an excuse to be near whenever Brent was around. If he went to the porch, she showed up saying she wanted some fresh air. If he sat at the table, she said she wanted to help refill drinks. There was something in the way they looked at each other, like they shared a secret language no one else understood. Jonathan, never a jealous man, simply observed. But his mind registered every detail. The stifled laughs, the looks quickly diverted when they realized they were being watched. The light touch on Brent's arm when she laughed at something he said. All subtle, but real. During dinner, Melissa seemed restless. She played with her food, kept checking her phone, left the table twice saying she needed to take work calls, but didn't speak to anyone on the phone when she returned. Jonathan knew because he quietly followed and saw her only typing messages. When she came back to the table, she avoided his eyes. She said it was just a minor emergency with a factory supplier, nothing serious. Jonathan didn't respond. He just smiled and pretended to believe her. Later, when everyone was sitting around in the living room chatting, Melissa said she had a headache and went upstairs to rest. Jonathan stayed downstairs talking with the others for a bit, but his thoughts were elsewhere. Something inside him was bothering him quietly, almost suffocatingly. When he went up to the bedroom, he found Melissa sleeping on her side, her phone beside the bed. The screen flickered with a notification. Jonathan hesitated for a second, but the pain of doubt was stronger than any hesitation. He picked up the phone, unlocked it, and read the messages. There they were, conversations with Brent. And there was nothing subtle about them. They were provocative, full of flirtation, closeness, and plans. But what made Jonathan take a deep breath and sit on the edge of the bed was one specific message: "We'll meet tomorrow on the trail, as planned." He'll never figure it out. That weekend, which had started as a chance to relax, had now become the setting for something he could no longer ignore. The betrayal was right in front of him. And worse, it wasn't just a fling. There was intention, planning, secrecy. This wasn't a one-night affair, it was a carefully crafted scheme with codes and clear steps. Jonathan put the phone back where it was, stood up, and walked into the bathroom. He stared at his reflection, trying to understand how things had gotten to this point. The woman he helped build an empire with, the woman he admired, loved, was plotting everything behind his back. And with someone who, until that afternoon, was a complete stranger. What Jonathan didn't know yet was that this betrayal hid more than just emotional infidelity. It hid personal interests. And this story, far from ending there, was only just beginning. Jonathan spent the rest of the night awake, unable to erase the words he had read from his mind. The messages between Melissa and Brent weren't just intimate, they were damaging. They revealed a plan already in motion, something much bigger than an emotional affair. It smelled like strategy, as if every move had been calculated. The way Melissa carried the conversations, the terms she used, the references to upcoming business decisions, all of it made Jonathan's stomach churn. This wasn't just cheating. It was a developing scheme. At dawn, while Melissa still slept, Jonathan stepped outside to walk alone down the dirt road leading to the main gate of the property. He needed to think, breathe, organize his thoughts. Each step made his mind race faster. It was then that he remembered a conversation he had with Melissa months ago during dinner at home, when she mentioned a struggling competitor. She spoke enthusiastically about the possibility of acquiring the company, saying she had already reviewed the numbers and considered it strategically smart to absorb the brand, which had access to a different customer base. Jonathan listened carefully at the time, but didn't get involved. He always left the commercial side to her. That had been the agreement from the start. He handled the foundation, the finances, the guarantees, while Melissa was the face and the brain behind the brand. Back at the countryside house, Jonathan grabbed the laptop he always brought on trips and began searching for information about Brent. He needed to understand who he was. It only took a few minutes to find everything. Brent Matthews, CEO of Livia Beauty, a mid-sized company operating in the same sector as Melissa's brand. The surprise came when he discovered that Brent was actually the owner of the very company Melissa had mentioned months earlier, the one she considered buying. The connection was now clear. She had known him before that weekend. The idea that they had just met by chance was a lie. Melissa had planned this meeting. Or worse, the affair had already begun, and the weekend was just a test to see how far they could go. Jonathan sat at the table, read more about Brent's company, and a question hit him like a punch: did Melissa really drop the acquisition due to technical issues, or was there a hidden motive? The answer came shortly after when he accessed their shared corporate email account and searched for records of meetings, proposals, evaluations. He found no sequence of negotiations leading to the purchase of Livia. Quite the opposite, he found an email from Melissa stating that the company wasn't worth the risk. That didn't make sense. That competitor was viable, with good distribution and a lean structure. It would have been the perfect acquisition. So why had she given up? Jonathan felt the pieces lining up like dominoes. Melissa dropped the acquisition because she got involved with the owner. And she got involved not just romantically, but because she saw a bigger opportunity, not to buy the company, but to align herself with it through another path. The idea formed with frightening clarity. Melissa intended to leave everything behind: marriage, business, stability. She bet everything on a new scenario where she and Brent would form a couple and, together, combine forces to dominate the market. Jonathan knew Melissa's ambition. He had always admired her ability to spot opportunities. But for the first time, he saw that quality turn into a double-edged knife. Melissa had crossed a line. She had not only deceived him as a wife, but as a business partner. As a life partner. With a tight chest and a mix of anger and frustration swirling in his mind, Jonathan recalled Melissa's messages again, one by one. The conversations had coded language, but not enough to hide the real plans. There were mentions of the future, phrases like, "we'll grow together," "the merger will be both emotional and professional," and even comments about how predictable and distracted Jonathan was. That hurt, not just the words themselves, but the certainty that his trust had been coldly manipulated. That's when something inside him shifted. Sadness gave way to strategy. Jonathan had spent years being the silent pillar of the company. The media spoke about Melissa, investors praised her presence at events, but what no one saw was the invisible foundation holding up that empire. And that foundation was him. The company, although carrying Melissa's name and image, had roots in his resources. Jonathan remembered the long nights he spent risking his own assets to fund the early days of the brand. The contracts signed with his name as guarantor. The investments made before the company even started making profits. He never asked for recognition for that. Never cared about shining. But now, those old decisions would be his greatest weapons. He started walking again, but this time with a different focus. He was no longer the betrayed husband trying to understand why he fell. He was the majority shareholder of a company about to be used for personal gain. And he had a card saved, one Melissa had forgotten even existed. The difference now was that he had no intention of staying quiet. And she would find out soon enough. The next morning, with the house still full of people, he told Melissa he wasn't feeling well and needed to go home early. She frowned, clearly annoyed by his sudden announcement, and said she intended to stay until the end of the holiday, as originally planned. But Jonathan, with a firm gaze, replied that wasn't an option. If he was leaving, she was too. We came together. We leave together, he said calmly, but with no room for negotiation. Melissa was furious, sighed heavily, tried to argue, but realized she had no choice. She pretended to accept, hurriedly packed her things, and came downstairs in silence. Jonathan simply watched. For him, this was no longer a getaway. It was the beginning of a new phase, and she was about to discover what he had prepared. During the earliest years of the company, when the idea was still just a sketch on paper, Jonathan was the one who invested money, credit, and his name in the first contracts. It was a difficult period, with no investors and no guarantee of return. Melissa had the vision, but he had the capital. She introduced herself as CEO, spoke at events, built networks, and appeared on industry magazines. Jonathan was seen as the supportive husband, and that never bothered him. He preferred working behind the scenes. Anyone watching from the outside believed Melissa was both the brains and muscle of the company. But only those who read the original contract knew the truth. Jonathan was the majority shareholder with 51% of the shares. And that changed absolutely everything. In the days that followed, while Melissa continued her routine, believing her plan was under control, Jonathan met with his lawyers. He explained everything precisely. He started by detailing the ownership structure, then presented the messages between her and Brent. He made it clear he didn't want a public scandal, but he also wouldn't allow himself to be treated like a fool. The lawyers quickly grasped the situation. It was a case mixing marital infidelity with conflicts of interest and a breach of trust within the business partnership. What was at stake wasn't just the marriage, it was the integrity of the company itself. One of the more experienced lawyers suggested the smartest path forward, initiating a partial dissolution of both the marital and business partnership, based on the Uniform Partnership Act. This would allow Jonathan to buy out Melissa's share using the company's own financial valuation, determined by independent experts. In the following days, Jonathan continued his daily routine normally. He had breakfast next to her, listened to her stories about meetings, and pretended not to know anything. Meanwhile, legal procedures were already underway. A full financial audit was requested. Strategic blocks were prepared to ensure Melissa couldn't make any decisions without his approval. She didn't notice anything. She was so emotionally wrapped up with Brent and so confident in her own sense of control that she didn't suspect a thing. She believed Jonathan was unaware, as always. What she failed to understand was that he had already taken control. Parallel to that, the lawyers worked on the most delicate part, the clause for removal due to just cause. Yes, that existed. The company bylaws provided that in cases where actions caused intentional harm to the partnership or represented a severe breach of trust between shareholders, the offending party could be removed, as long as the conflict of interest was proven. And the proof was there. Messages, plans, unilateral decisions. Melissa hadn't just betrayed her husband. She had used her position in the company to advance a personal plan with a direct competitor. It wasn't just a moral failure, it was commercially harmful. While Jonathan organized himself legally, he decided to do something else: talk to an old investor who had always maintained a close relationship with him. During the meeting, he carefully shared what was happening. The investor was surprised but supportive. He said that if Jonathan needed extra funds to repurchase Melissa's shares, he could count on him. This conversation was crucial for Jonathan, as it ensured financial peace of mind in case he needed to pay Melissa's share up front, something that would further weaken any attempt at negotiation. Behind the scenes, Jonathan was becoming increasingly firm. And the most impressive part was watching Melissa continue her life as if she were 2 steps ahead. She exchanged messages with Brent, planned short trips under the guise of industry events, pretended to be too exhausted to discuss the company's direction. What she didn't know was that, soon, she would receive a legal notice informing her that her partner had initiated a dissolution process, that her presence was being challenged legally, and that she would lose any administrative decision-making rights until everything was resolved. Jonathan had already signed the documents. An audit was about to begin. The lawyers were simply waiting for the right moment to deliver the notice. Jonathan, though wounded, maintained the calmness of a man who had been deceived but refused to act impulsively. He transformed his pain into action. And this time, it was he who was 2 steps ahead. Melissa had no idea that the ground beneath her feet had already started to crumble. And when she finally realized, it would be too late to retreat. Jonathan already knew. He had the evidence, screenshots, conversation logs, contract analyses, and legal opinions, all structured and ready. But part of him still wanted to confront the facts face to face. Maybe to silence any lingering doubts, maybe just to confirm the kind of person he had shared his life with for so many years. He silently followed Melissa that afternoon when she rushed out saying she was visiting a supplier. Jonathan watched her enter a restaurant at the shopping center, and not long after, Brent arrived. They sat in a more private corner, talked with calculated smiles, leaned in for a long kiss. No disguise, no fear. Just the confidence of someone who believes the world is under control. Across the street, Jonathan raised his phone and recorded everything. The betrayal was no longer digital, it became physical, tangible. When the kiss ended, he crossed the street and entered. He walked straight to their table. The two of them were startled. Brent turned pale. Melissa simply crossed her arms and gave a smile mixing challenge with contempt. She looked at Jonathan like someone unimportant. Stood up, faced him directly, and spoke coldly, "I don't regret anything. In fact, I want to separate from you. Brent and I are going to be together." Brent didn't say anything. He just looked down. Melissa took a deep breath and continued. She said she was tired of living with someone predictable, dull, who was great for providing structure but never understood her rhythm. She explained her plan was simple: with the divorce, she would give up his shares if he agreed to peacefully exit the company. She said she had already convinced Brent to merge their companies. The new brand name was already being designed. They would become the power couple of the market, a reference in business and lifestyle. Everything had already been planned. And she wanted him to be smart enough to sign the papers and move on with his life in peace. Jonathan listened in silence. Customers around them pretended not to notice, but the atmosphere had grown heavy. When Melissa finished speaking, she waited for a response, a shout, a gesture, anything. But Jonathan only stared at her for a few seconds, with the calmness of someone who sees the end without needing to say anything else. He put his phone in his pocket, turned around, and walked away, firm steps, no hesitation. Melissa stood still, a slight smile on the corner of her lips, thinking she had won. She believed she had finally removed Jonathan from the equation. That now the world belonged to her and Brent. That she was in control of everything. And that's exactly when the game turned. She just didn't know it yet. Jonathan left the restaurant without looking back. The bitter taste of betrayal still burned in his throat, but his steps were firm, filled with silence that said more than any scream. As he pushed the door open to go outside, he took a deep breath, as if trying to expel the last trace of the pain Melissa had inflicted on him. It was over, and he knew it. But unlike her, who exposed everything in a restaurant like throwing cards on a casino table, Jonathan preferred the kind of response that came quietly, but with consequences. He returned home as if closing a chapter. He opened the closet, grabbed only what truly belonged to him, some clothes, company documents, the old watch he inherited from his father, and a photo of him with his mother before she died. Each object carried a different weight now. He passed through the bedroom without looking at the bed they had shared for years. He went downstairs, wrote a brief note, "Don't look for me. You'll understand why." He left the keys on the kitchen counter. His destination was the functional apartment they kept near the office. A place without memories, without traces of perfume on pillows, without signs of a recent past. It was all he needed. When he arrived, he dropped his bag in the corner, took off his shoes, and sat in front of the laptop. There were no tears on his face. Only cold determination. The first message was direct to his lawyer, "Approved. Proceed with everything." The second, to the advisory board, "Urgent extraordinary meeting tomorrow at 8 a.m. Agenda, urgent restructuring." The third, to the chief accountant, "I need a full report of Melissa's movements in the last 6 months. Urgent and confidential." The clock barely marked 5 in the morning when he finished typing everything. He didn't sleep. Didn't need to. What kept him upright was the unwavering decision to flip the script with the same coldness Melissa had stabbed him with. Before the workday began, the documents initiating the partial dissolution of both the marital and business partnership were officially filed at the courthouse. Nothing was done impulsively. Jonathan followed the company bylaws point by point, including the evidence, messages with Brent, the secret meetings, and proof of the merger plan she had orchestrated outside the formal business structure. The notification was personally delivered by an officer, with a signed receipt. Melissa opened the envelope in the hallway and read it right there, in front of the delivery person, while her breakfast cooled on the table. When she understood what it was about, her fingers trembled, her face lost color. She tried calling Jonathan several times. On the third attempt, he answered. His voice was firm, without anger, but with the authority of someone who no longer owed explanations. "Everything follows the contract. Read it carefully." And he hung up. That same day, the injunction suspending Melissa's administrative powers was granted. Within hours, she lost immediate access to the management system, board meetings, and digital signature. HR was instructed not to route any matters to her anymore. Her office remained locked, her belongings collected and sealed. Within 48 hours, the woman who for years was the public face of the company had neither voice nor vote. And the first one to realize this was Brent. When Brent learned about the injunction, he tried contacting Melissa, but there was no reunion. He disappeared from the radar. He sold his shares in his own company and withdrew his name from a joint project announced just weeks earlier. Melissa was left stranded with her plan undone in her hands. Promises of power evaporated, important contacts stopped answering. No investor trusted an executive who lost everything over a personal mistake. In the final agreement, based on the clause of removal for just cause and potential damages caused by her behavior, Jonathan acquired 100% of the shares. The brand was restructured. New campaigns were launched. The focus returned to its original purpose, results, without unnecessary luxury or vanity. Melissa, who believed she was in control of the game, lost everything in less than 2 months. The marriage became a closed file. The company she thought she controlled was now a distant memory. And her reputation, built over years, collapsed under the silent calculation of a man she underestimated. Jonathan didn't give interviews, didn't appear in headlines, didn't expose her downfall even once. He continued working quietly, day after day. And months later, while walking through the main corridor of headquarters, he saw a new group of interns seated for training. He paused, silently observing. One of the young men stood up and said, "It's an honor to meet you, Mr. Blake." Jonathan responded only with a slight smile and said, "Build with character. Because talent draws attention. But it's character that holds everything together when the structure shakes." And he continued on his way. The world kept turning. But now, he was in charge of his own story. Thank you for watching the video. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you won't miss any updates. See you next time.